Recording is in progress. Welcome to three poets reading in the second slot of our opening day of virtual panels for the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture since 1900. I'm very pleased to be introducing Mark Tardi, Christopher Smith, and Maggie Warren. And I'll introduce each poet sort of separately. So we'll start with Mark, and then we'll go in the order that I've got you here in the program. And we should have ample time to discuss and talk to the poets about their work. There are a number of folks in the room, and I believe the chat function is enabled, so we'll be able to use that as well. So we are going to begin with Mark Tardi, who is a writer and translator whose many awards include a 2023 PennHeim Translation Grant and a 2022 NEA Translation Fellowship. He's the author of 4 books, most recently Recapitulation in the Wrong Key from BlazeVox, as well as The Circus of Trust from Dalkey Archive. And he is a very accomplished translator as well. Translations include Viscera, 8 Voices from Poland, Unsovereign by Kaspar Bartzak, if I've got the pronunciation correctly, The Squatter's Gift by Robert Rybicki, and Faith in Strangers by Katarzyna Solinska. Recent writing and translations have appeared in Bombay Gin, Poetry Conjunctions, Mayday, Interim, many other places, including Chicago Review, where I was very pleased to first encounter his work years ago. And he's on the faculty at the University of Lodz. Mark.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I appreciate your time. And I put a link in the chat of a segment of the book that I'm going to be reading some excerpts from that just appeared bilingually in Italy in a journal called Argo. So I'll read a couple of those poems, the English version, and you can check out the Italian version if you like as well. But before I start talking about and reading from my own work, I'd like to take a moment to share a poem of a friend of mine and a friend of some of yours. I think that some of you knew him and worked with him, Larry Sawyer, who passed away about a year ago, unfortunately. So this is a poem of his that is also a BlazeVox publication. It's in his book called Vertigo Diary, and it's one that sort of hit me with like a ton of bricks to the chest when I first read it. It's one that I've read before, but I'd like to read with you all. It's called My Sunflower, and this is by Larry Sawyer. Why was each moment such a miniature Troy? Grief is the calculus you lack. Don't kill yourself over it. A raven sleeps in each fold of the wind. Notes about me are locked in a glance across an omnipresent table. It's useless, according to my analyst, to ponder dogs. We're outer space primates. Meanwhile, the continent ticks. No one groks the combo. This coin is the lord of your hand. Her dress is plural, such greasy wine. Where's the zookeeper with the bill? Under the piano of summer, we're deep as beans. So I encourage you to check out Larry's work. And also there's going to be a posthumous collection called The Blue Butterfly that's going to come out, I think early next year with Guernica Editions in Canada. So I'm going to read from my new book called Recapitulation in the Wrong Key. And the book, just to say a little bit about it, it's loosely structured on Chopin's Second Piano Sonata, very loosely. If he were a Chicagoan who grew up on the South Side near industrial sludge most of his life. So if he were that instead of who he was. So it has a four-part structure. The first part is a series of poems that are based off of riffs of lines from Polish poets who I've translated or had some dealings with. So I'm going to read a couple of those, uh, and they all start with poem beginning with a line by. So this is poem beginning with a line by Alexandra Bierska. I'm building an ark on the edge of the bed, all a wobble in your doubt. The luster and the lamprey and the lute, heresies woven from question marks like roundels with a projecting tongue. The city within made of red porphyry and skirted echoes of every emotion, not unlike a mathematician's orange, the axiomatic moral, always perfect. And I think one thing I just want to preface is that as I was looking over some things to read, there's a lot of curse words. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm just, swearing all the time. I think that like my other books don't have any, and I think I stored all of them. I saved them for this book. I think my mother would have been proud. She was a much better swearer than I am, but this is a poem called Poem Beginning with a Line by Nina Mano. Polar hours bind the polymer day, the way caution can shade into sclerosis. A man dressed to tango handed me a taco, not unlike a braided river, not unlike the damper pedal on a piano. Being bitten on the clavicle is much harder while on horseback, or the rural zests intended for various feasts of the liturgical year, like Ritz crackers you pilfer from your own child commanding fascination simply by moving through the room. This is called Poem Beginning with a Line by Zofia Chipulets. 1. Is being fucked up a kind of accent? Should we aim, 2, for towering perukes and scented hankies, a braided river or octo crust? 3. The moon hates you because you're pillow-tongued and hypoglycemic and a little bit wispy. 4. Plants askew, bike starting to rust out. Is anything a better fly swatter? 5. Than a book of poetry? Would you have made out with Mike Tyson? 6. And or Judy Garland? Which is to say, can you arrive at hunger? This is the last one from this opening sequence. Poem beginning with a line by Katarzyna Szaulinska. Because sidewalks in Berlin always look wet and the fonts too familiar, because all roads lead to Warsaw or a chicken coop, because Philip Larkin was a real motherfucker, or maybe it was Otto von Bismarck. The way curls and coils are extracted from motherhood, rock flower on smooth water, velvety blue like Holyfield's ear surrounding ferro concrete, or when cork is not equal to cork, the shimmery cloud of particles. Because on the train home, somebody smeared what I can only hope was a booger on the window. The antipathy for mushrooms very real, because English offers no feminine form of pelican. Okay. The next thing I'm going to read is the second movement of the sonata, which I've never read in its entirety. So this will be sort of a new experience. And it starts with um, a quote, a segment from an earlier book of mine. I'm plagiarizing or stealing from myself that functions as a kind of epigraph. Instead of splinters, certainties. Wine is wet fire, stone, coagulated dust. I know that I love my mother and yours, and some days that's almost enough. So this segment is called "Myself When I Am Real," which is riffing off of Charles Mingus's fantastic piano composition. And partly it attracted me because I just really love Mingus's work, but I also love the fact that Mingus recorded a piano album as a bass player, and then he, had an enormous flex in the liner notes where he ends with saying, if a piano or if a bass player can record a piano record this good, then the piano players better get to work. Um, so, and this was something that I wrote in Austin, Texas, while I was at the Harry Ransom Center. There's just so much wild stuff there. It was like sort of rocket fuel for the brain. This is myself when I'm real. The camera doesn't record my misdirected anger, pissant grievances, or quiet elation, the 4+ decades of dog shit removal, the way whisker becomes weasel, becomes barrier to doing, the last vestiges of restraint, the little toxic drops scumbled into our lives, as if to see the world as molecular, the sky made of brushed steel that looks like a Welsh word. The almost every day of stretched hamstrings, the foothills of confiscation, some dents in the nameless electrical love songs of fish, dreams gangrenous and marbled like big legs of tone to knock the bottom out of space. Every hotel the same, maybe the purest form of quid pro quo, misdirected elation or restraint or drift excess the camera doesn't record. To edge beyond acceptability like a statistical Catholic, the toddler caressing your face, the uncovering of the already known that trades suspicion for confidence for a calculated smile, the 2,000 miles traversed just cutting lawns, getting the gunk out of the gutters, catch basin, and shower drain, nor is it enough to know the rules of counterpoint, even if the humidity's 96%. The discontinuous character of mourning, cruel tangents that remain unrecorded, the rust-spattered skylark, the cologne-drenched traffic stop, and the Bowie knife tucked under the armrest, because worrying is one thing I'm very good at. The lamb cakes all dressed up, the sandwich shop glued to prices 20 years ago, and the grizzled neighbor's tits a metronomic dangle mid-window as the lunging snakes set ablaze in the gangway. No wonder my knees are shot, a blink cloud made entirely from particle board and merino wool, sanding something like the truth only to stab myself and record a scar. The way the desert can give you whatever you need, not friends but mountains to absorb light or magnify menace, a tiger in the slush to revise the terms of the habitat, to purse the curve, to love the failure of memory, every kind of noise from a cantata to a club fight. Because there's no theater afterwards, the tables and chairs, a way to know, for the dog I'm not interested in, for the adding of what wasn't, a portion of moral elegance or alibi for silence subsumed in declension, the vertigo not so tout, a Ponzi scheme built on shared acceptance but beautiful, the lurking promise of something clandestine, the kicked compost tulips and tumors, the way the numbers bent the light, a window or cage automated to a Jesuit tinge, without restraint, tacit. The jeopardy recklessly sought to improve your cosmology. So what if you didn't invent salt or fuck in glitter, the maestro fact likely to withdraw all curses upon me, to outrun a speeding fissure that the camera fails to record? The relationship between event and crisis not always direct. There's no theory of aspirin, the two ghosts just being seated, a form of guilt or quiet elation flung with debris like broken trophies and assorted hardware. The blueprint for imprecision, the constipation of time that's less than seductive. That the typewriter's listed under stipulated property, never mind the pipes, shingles, loose insulation, a spool for a hose from another era, the rust-spattered grievance almost earned, my legs a metronomic dangle between floor and ceiling as if hollowed out by a few locks of hair, the no longer and not yet. A basic portrait of spelunking, the insect's compound eyes like stolen robots and the relative wind always confessed, but never told not to. Inside photosynthesis, sign plants, and hidden orders where pissing in the sink makes sense, not quite a rule, but a distinct tendency. that remains unrecorded, that spins without purchase, bypassing all the stages of bureaucratic deformation, so seductive that the church forbade it. The archival entropy, the behavior that discourages questions or disables spontaneous charisma. I can't wait to see your sourness, your improvised insults, the infinite consanguinity it bears, the softened restraint, anger looped at whatever the frequency. Just another form of usable ordnance or graft fimbriate. Because we can't even wear our heads right. The definitions of sabbatical or shithawk, such as they are, the factory refurbishment of violence, a seduction pretending to be a renunciation, to run the court at Wentworth, to remap a boundary at all hours and achieve the ghost. No simultaneity anywhere in this integer, where consistency becomes another kind of grievance and hurry the fuck up another name for God that the camera's unable to record. The necessary blindness of natural laws, a way to prevent solitude to tap at the latch door leaning, the hybrid generosity or ritual elation, this hello of sea and sand dollar, even if this is a Midwestern prairie, side swayed with the ruinous. I consorted dance both mimic and engineer alive to new information like waking up with corn dust on the tongue, a coyote fold on the ludic frequency, working out its own poisons. No wonder limbing hopelessness doesn't offer an exit, the stylized echoes we hear on the phone over a freight train or airplane, the devil's interval that eclipses a shared yawn, the way derivation can be drift, part of an entirely new topology, a paradise of compensation built into the architecture, the relatively secure and predictable past, adjacent to conspicuous failure or convulsive celibacy untethered from the ruinous, ever present, a new species of silence that the camera can't record. The plain fact that fuckface and facefuck aren't interchangeable. So many compounds seeping through Hegwish, the sky gets tilted and the blood unfurls. The way lake becomes leech, becomes ant-red resentment, becomes hot slag to purge your associations, or the molecular restraint I have no choice but to believe in. As afraid of having too much time as not enough. To say nothing of the crowd at the carnival, the fundamental competence of a Phillips head or tack hammer, the rust-colored elation, the countless dishes scrubbed and dogs bathed, the new generation of kiosk owners not on my timeline. That a baby's breathing sketches the horizon of its own possibility. Another instance of the porousness of certain borders, the accumulated weariness, regrets, misdirected expectations, or ecstasy, the humor and terror to provide a deeper palliative, to be reduced to diminished gestures and autumnal grunts, the quiet attrition, a down payment on my maturity that the camera doesn't record, allergic to the disco slickness, the loopholes welcome, for the adding of what wasn't, just as mausoleum became midway, became an urn cut with a key that will always revise its terms. Uh, and if your Chicago geography is spotty, Hegwish is a neighborhood on the southeast side of Chicago that is kind of down drift from a lot of Indiana um, industrial runoff. It's where my mother grew up, and she died at the age of 58, sadly. And I only learned at her memorial that 40% of her high school class had expired. So that was pretty eye-opening. And to that effect, there's another poet that I would like to share with you that's not me, which is Garen Cycle, and he's been writing about the Midwest in a series of long poems. I think that this is his newest book, but Jeffrey, who is his publisher and my publisher, would be able to tell me for sure. But this is from Prairie, and this kind of dovetails with what I had just finished reading, so I wanted to share this with you. So this is from Prayer Read, and this is from a segment of this long poem that starts with, "When does water stop being water?" When does water stop being water? Some new desert or old chaos? The waters the same, sail of soil, horde of waters. The supermarket's endless shelf dysgenesis. The waters are moving. The substance there, the word for it, calumet, slack water, or Desplaines, barely a mud pit through much of the year, or beyond the Michigan Sea, every port has a name for its sea. Narcissus gazes into black water. Father Marquette maps here out of place. The slow seep walks along sedges, the canoe in its imperceptible leak, the words drained and me putting things into my mouth, like that was the source of my words. How the page takes ink, how the land takes water, the pond recovered, greater part. Possible cancer clusters, notoriously hard to prove. Okay, thank you for your patience. I'm just gonna finish with a poem that I read about Christopher that he's interested in AI, and I think that this might be connected with his poem. So I'm going to try to dovetail this a little bit for you. So I have a writing class at the University of Łódź, a media writing class, and when ChatGPT initially went live, I gave my students this exercise, this sort of put a an autobiography prompt into ChatGPT, 100-word autobiography, and sort of see what it gives you, and then verify, like fact check it, verify it. And to put my money where my mouth is, I did the same thing. Um, and it was like sort of 30% accurate. I mean, it did note that I'm a poet and I'm from Chicago, but it got a lot of details wrong, including every publication that it confidently listed. It listed the series of poems, and I wrote down all the titles because I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Um, and so I felt bad for ChatGPT, so I wrote a poem that it seemed to think it was a poem of mine called Epithalmium. I hadn't written that poem, but then I did later to sort of I don't know if it has any issues with confidence, but at least one of the things that it was confidently saying was true that had been false would now be true. So this is called epithalmium, and this is from the sort of elegiac third movement, the funeral march movement of the sonata. Because in the kitchen it's difficult to lie. Because the yearbook photo shows long, straight hair parted down the middle, Marsha Brady style. Because in my son's mind, he has only one Jadek and Babcha, and that blind spot diminishes me more each day. Sorry. The vanity of everything factual, tea drinkers and their charges. Because you've gotten me so pissed off that I'm crawling, like a roadside forger of wounds, the preferred hymns of insects, of all the world's cobblers. Because yesterday dinner was a roadrunner, the wrong coat, a spark that bled repeatedly. Because what's a necessity for a dancer, for a puppet, is merely a circumstance, the end of all that being looked at, not a rational attic or cybernetic bee. Because traversal becomes fractal, becomes lacy potato, which you made but rarely ate. Because I don't want to be put in the ground, a reservoir for true forgiveness, inexhaustible, residing in somebody else's memories, like trying to describe the entire architecture of a house by staring at one square tile on the floor. Excuse me, geez. Because shushu don't have hands or eyes or a buja or legs, because there are no statistics to support this feeling. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Our next poet is Christopher Smith, who hails from West Texas. He is the author of the chapbooks Warren from Ghost City Press and 24 covers of A House on Fire from Finishing Line Press here in Kentucky. And his Pushcart and Best of the Net nominated work has appeared in Colorado Review, Image, DMQ Review, Psaltery, and Lyre, Lit, and elsewhere. He's been a writer in residence through the Spring Creek Project in Chicago Art Department and is currently pursuing a PhD in English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm going to share my screen here. Is everybody seeing a slide? Hopefully, something that says Poetic Sphere. Fabulous. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful reading. That was really outstanding. And I love that prompt, that idea that we can respond to sort of the fictions or the new truths that AI are creating about other things, but I'd never really explored the new truths that it's creating about ourselves. I think it's a really an exciting notion. I'm going to share some new work as well and then talk a little bit about the way that my work interfaces with the world of AI. I think it's important before talking about AI and any instances we're engaging with AI, just to acknowledge that AI is a terrorizing force that is, destroying our planet and eroding our democracy and changing the way that our brains work and our students' brains work and impacting our privacy and doing so many things that are quite dangerous and scary. But I think scarier still is the idea of looking back when AI is even more pervasive and thinking that I never engaged, never tried to understand, never tried to seek possible positivities within it for the world of language and poetry, never tried to center poetry and the humanities and conversations around AI in its development. So I have begun exploring in a variety of different ways, hopefully thoughtfully, hopefully responsibly, some of these themes. One is expanding craft capacity, using AI to do things that I'm not really able to do on my own, particularly in digital spaces, to speaking to and with the tech, sort of comparable to some of the practices it sounds like you've engaged with your students, Mark, and practices of resistance and response, thinking about ways that poetry is innately resistant to the idea of AI and AI-driven language and what we're trying to do. Thinking about expanding capacity, I'll share two projects here where I've relied on a platform called Claude, which you may be familiar with. It's sort of similar to ChatGPT. They claim to be more ethical and environmentally conscious, but who knows? It is a tool that has helped me, because I do not have any sturdy coding background, to take digital compositions that I've developed and put them into spaces online to make them more accessible, to do things like add visual elements like this lovely model of a bridge beam that you're seeing here, or even the nature of this page, which is intended to sort of follow what an early thousands county council meeting minutes web page might look like. It also shifts the way that the reader can engage with the text, as you'll see, where instead of encouraging all the language being available, thinking about the way that AI wants us to move quickly and skim through language, this forces the reader to slow down by making one word generate at a time. And I'll show you that. So this is a poem called "The County Council Proposes a Counter Proposal." Against the county's ratified beam, bridge, its trestle points, span, abutment, bar, pier ratified at last month's arguably non-quota meeting, and by the proposing firm paper shade, a version to breathe before the tracks are laid down. Against the firm's overhead transparencies, depictions of on concrete, stone, tar, gravel, coke, the many treatments that may flat a road, against a higher option for the boats, against one fixed plank sterling and lateral option, against cantilever and truss for a display of angle weight sharing the accommodation of our dynamic loads, which, not necessarily locomotives, the first firm has proposed, may rather bear the rock, the daily go, 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 grit, city commuting our citizens' cars alone, grade, predictable ways, no trains. Against, yes, we were promised this, the flotilla of sails through the columns below. I know this group doesn't need to be reminded that Gerald Ford, quote, "compromise is the oil that makes governments go." We can find another path for the train track. We can become the state's darling in our simple moderation out of fiscal responsibility, which is to say, love. We oppose this first proposal against administrative overreach, against pylon hatched shadow, those low slung ties, against unfundable pylons. A bond issue, brothers, sisters, we tried. Today, let us counter this initial decision. A new distribution burden, there's still time, a new portrait of American transit. When we cross our water, it is not common. Toward our own gravity, we should more often collapse. Against such an expensive design is proposed here instead the animation of a basic swing bridge, inspired by a contributor to the Wikipedia Commons retired engineer, or so one might imagine, learning the latter softwares of motion. The swings, as implied by the name, gift size, wiles of machinery, the great reveal, actually less turned than prestige, arms braced, then done dervish, unweighted and sturdy for meters, the river spray, the lope across a span, in pirouette on point, the versionable pier unlocked and pinned by a bridge keeper kept up. The budget line cannot conjure better. A simple swing and the pensioned bridge keeper, their civic hourly spent watching the bend ahead for semaphore, sails, instruction while they consider arms, lateral motion, the forelocks, the aft, the common towing pneumatic winch, the noble creature, the bridge keeper, their picture on the Bureau for Local Tourism's brochure, come closer. Picture them smoking, a gaze out at the horizon, the evocation of fairy person history balanced against our modern country cantons. On the make, the bridge keepers smile, gap teeth, memory of their child's sure embrace, then snap back. The community college's amateur catamaran or course swing bridge, swing that no sloop loses its mainsail, that with the river our people advance, that everyone on shore must get out of their car and wait. In advance of the formal vote, it was motioned and passed. The discussion moved to executive session. Subsequent minutes to post at a later date. This is a little different than this exercise, which is called a poem called Lenormand.exe. Again, I was leaning into the help of Claude, where I would submit, language to input into the code and sort of a framework for what I would like the page to do, and it would pitch back an option, and we'd go back and forth a bit and tweak and then develop something that looked like this. This is engaging with the idea of the Lenormand deck, sort of used in cartomancy and fortune telling, the way that tarot is used. It's a deck that includes 36 different symbols intended to be resonant and transcultural. And so I wrote a piece of language for each of these symbols. So when you would click on something like lilies, consider the least, consider beautiful, it is so quiet, or bouquet, I found yellow in the light, handsome thrashing, or cross, bled, I feel holy only after, or house, it is 7 and father is sawing. These pieces of language where I'm sort of giving over control as to how the reader might engage with their path of movement through the poem, whether they even choose to click on certain passages at all. And again, to create this practice of slowing the reader down, this tool here at the top too allows readers to get a reading where they receive 3 cards randomly selected from the deck, so that they have one to meditate on their past with, bear, big dip, little cross, and stars will follow truly. Present, fish, what was benthic was born is gray salting. Future, stars, you don't know once read yourself at last. Return to deck and you can rinse and repeat and continue to go. Again, things that that present on the page in a certain way, but I really wouldn't be able to share in the ways that are interesting to me without the aid of something like AI. Thinking too about types of AI that are not as comprehensive and capable as Gen AI platforms like LLMs or large language models, where I've been enabled to speak to and with the tech. These are some poems that are built off of work with an old LLM called InfairKit from Adam Daniel King. It's unfortunately no longer available online. I think its use sort of died out with the advent of other more capable AIs. But it was fun in that it was a space where there was lots and lots of language built in, but it wasn't attached to the web. It wasn't expanding and learning how you used. It was just like this fixed system where you would put in text and it would shoot text back at you. It would use its algorithm to predict what words it thought would logically be the ones to extend next. And so this is a series of poems where I would put in a famous poem, in this instance, Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, and it would write a poem in response, and then I would respond to that response. So sort of two steps removed from Hayden here, one step removed from the AI itself. After an LLM number 13, and I know nothing more of love's offices or logic than the artificial intelligence spitting out love is the only law of the universe, love as law, love as parental intention or sorrow, love as Polestar or Python. I holler back with lines of C++, repeat. What I was shown of love, what matters is that the score surpasses your comfort, the other person's feelings. The computer calls it the heart of all that is. My ruby-visaged father divorced after 33 years and dying of nicotine and sodium and what one could call joy. This series was developed with the tool being set to parameters where it was trying to make very close logical suggestions, where it was sort of attaching to, like, if here's the root word as it's thinking about syntax, it's going for the piece of diction that is next, that is closest in its algorithm. There are also settings where you can expand that quite far and say, actually, maybe pick the word that's like 10 steps removed, like one of the less likely words to follow. And that sort of generated some stranger responses. And in this longer poem, which I'll read some excerpts from, I was playing with that idea, and I would submit language and it would respond with things that were not as directly connected. There were certainly some connections. And as it progressed, it just got stranger and stranger. So yeah, the text on the left is mine. The text on the right is the large language models one. I am drawn out of me by 0, 1, by pixelated blue fish scales that fashion a day dawning pills by buttons. To apologies, a short walk, the free candy on the office ledge, bee-striped bucket since Halloween. Labor and transit only, deliveries for the Roberts family, all others will be cast away. A quilt and 70 pages, cerulean IKEA robe, hanging we are the internet of ourselves, and nobody may partake in this. At the edge of the lake, a few hours before dawn, a woman stands on a rock, stares out to sea, and says, we're all so lost, wishing we had you. Called me home. Hit your shoulders, a tire swing on a soggy rock, float like ducks, a perfect mistake, a forest burns, a final tree to ashes, and the lake. 2. Our cognition, like the lakes, automatic, agate strand, body weight, neural network of fossil and wave. We fill our designated vessel like any liquid may engage in a greater cycle, watering, ascension, collapse. See, the speedboat craft wakes inside the wedding cake canyon, nature, erode place. We, the same, a half-life, massing, for Whittle and Basin, the flood over pinion ducks, cross-hatching the bluest part of the sky. The Milky Way, 2005, by Maggie Nelson. Forward, my method in work is simply to try to be attentive. To write isn't to make up stories. I don't think about doing so, though if this small book gives me a platform, I might start to try it. Author's statement, by rendering the natural world which. 3. And there's everything natural about it. The alpha story numerical world, which fills our license plate, tray names, tattoos, citations, captions, citations, natural, composed. That's suppose this, where the accumulated leads what comes of collected plate language. We are a mass, we are a mast of everything. Our spiders got their legs wrapped about platform of belief, computer. Color it like your own. A single original moment, not one suckling a history of own, collective, chemical, told the inherited tumor, we bright lumber. Attempt to pick up the orb and take a step back, make a definite mark, an accounting of the result, and be filled with curiosity and the kind of ambition which finds a pretext, learns from failure, then moves on to a new place. Pick it up, fail, write a thing of repose, then make another. 5. The D replaces F, then markers replace self, inbox, attempt, program, intuition, Control L, the carriage clasp and quick return, the colon, the field, the angle bracket, the door, the shiny light of earthly capital, all that once felt beatific and directionless. Def, the wrong kind of substitution. 2 is the T, and why not commence? We think we are stamping on, but the mill is a machinery. The rollers will crush us, an inventor of forms by contrast. Add a few staffs and some custom work to the scraps, and it becomes a solemn one does this with A. And this last batch here are poems that are thinking about ways of resisting the means and methods of AI and responding to some new forms of language that are cultivated by AI. I think innately just writing poems, writing language that is sort of the Charles Bernstein idea of anti-absorptive language, language that is surprising, that can't be easily paraphrased, that doesn't fit into the logical constraints of AI as tidily as it might like. This all I think is inherently a form of resistance, and expanding on that a bit, that sort of as an underlay for the tone and the work, but also thinking about things like the new forms that are being developed by AI. So AI prompt as form, not just the question that one might submit, but also these very specific types of prompts that developers use when they are trying to get AI to create an image or a video for them. Often be these long strings of inputs and keywords that are separated by commas, where they're trying to narrow down, the image to get more and more and more specific to the thing that they're looking for. And so working in this form, but also including things that maybe are less easy to cultivate by an AI in terms of visual output. So this is prompt one. One brother isn't in woods, flannel, lit buck velvet, shoe glint, and a picnicker's gaze. Apples, startled bush mice, hyper-realistic meadow, the turnover of grace, blue stem, rye, the favored medicinal virtues, patchwork, walkway backwards, sepia in the 70s, crimson, arrow hairs twice snipped, lumber. Prompt two, light pickled, scythe in hand, waterproof, please, markers forgetful toward ever clear color of summer fruit. One, too many hands, the frank yet trifling Hoda headband, palm board with unfavorable pitch sand, the color of turning sand, a patchwork, a leaf, hourglass full of seed, flotilla of golden water, noodles passing the passion glam rocker in relief. Two, I'm thinking about the ways in which AI is shaping our memory and the way that we process language itself. I'm sure you've seen the studies showing that our short-term and our long-term memory is pretty cooked. We're in a place where, as we use apps that tell us how to get places, our brains are less reliant on remembering direction. As our photos are uploaded and held in these repositories online, we're less likely to be able to remember faces, and certainly data as well. If we don't need to remember the date of the Gettysburg Address because it's just right there, a click away. And so poetry that forces the reader, again, to slow down in the ways they're processing language, but also to engage their memory across the duration of a poem when it isn't all on the same page together. So this is from a series that's called Memory of St. Brendan. Spring is come, and I am willing, one warm gust, and I must, among all people, communicate the seasons by matching all faces. I cannot tell the water from the sea. And this final piece, again, just thinking about language that sort of resists logical progressions, creating unlikely and surprising and playful alignments of diction to perhaps subvert the way that AI is looking for easy patterns of language and rewarding those types of entry and churning out this sort of bland marketing copy that all sort of feels and sounds the same. Fourth plinth 30, pended for another overture. What season? What use will past tome? Teethy, arenaceous soapbox. Bite left into carnival, fight song off the canyon. My quiver in the quiver, my low parade refrain. Fields in pledge colors, they are not perfectly. In cartoon disardor, my muscular heart escapes me. Sweet imbalance totter me up field to 40. Cleft yard line, the year's line, the yearning my incisors. become furrowed brow, incise, become cannulated, frowning, the bath in another's marsh stains on Friday. It is better not. The glory I cannot speak like this. Our bodies right to tomorrow, when asked into others' throne. Low, the cabinet low, mimic fled, Thanksgiving. Splendid, adolescent, body what worthy, existence enough dusted, worthy, tongue unbreathed, beauty into unearth, bled between whistles holding, another in ripe amber fields, two old brains touching, they kiss each other, angels, salvation, blue. Great, thanks. That's me. Those are places where you can find me online, and other places. Uh, Thanks so much, everyone. I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Christopher. Much to consider in the convergence of AI and poetry. All right, our third and final reader will be Maggie Warren, who is a PhD student in literature, criticism, and textual studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She studies contemporary literature, and when not reading poetry, she's interested in horror, magical realism, memoir, and drama. Her dissertation focuses on poetry collections that innovate elegiac conventions through experimental forms. She's been recognized with both the John C. Hodges Tutoring Award and the David Hambright Teaching Fellowship, and her studies in contemporary poetry and experimental forms intersect with her writing practice. She is poetry co-editor for Grist, a journal of literary arts, fine magazine, and her recent and forthcoming creative publications include poems in Connecticut River Review, Swim, Had, Sultry and Lyre, One Art, and Red Branch Review. Her debut chapbook, The Bones That Map Us, was published by Bell Point Press in 2024.
Thank you, Joshua. That is basically a perfect lead into what I'm doing today, which I think is also going to yield some really interesting connections to Mark and Chris. So happy to follow up what you've been reading and sharing with what I have. So yeah, I am currently in the world of dissertating. And as my bio talks about, I'm focused on experimental elegies written by women. So I'm really intrigued by how newer collections have been using form to do this thing that we've done forever, probably since the beginning of poetry, which is write about loss and love and life, right? Currently, my obsession has been with prose poems. I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth in a second, but Obit by Victoria Chang plays a huge part in one of my chapters. And so for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about things I'm thinking through with prose poems, share some that I've written, including from my chapbook, and then end with, I think, some unpublished work. So let's start there with how interesting it is to be a graduate student and a creative writer. These two things, people want them to feel separate, and they just never are. So I'm going to begin with a poem called Runner at the Graveyard. My mother paid her respects to good health by walking through the town cemetery on Monday mornings. The one time I joined her on the circled asphalt path, she pointed to a granite marker. I like the dark ones best. That's the kind I want. My mother healed people for a living. She knew their ligaments better than their names. She knew the reaper's handshake better than her wedding vows. How peaceful to be alive and know just how you want your death objectified. How comfortable you must be with loss. When life has taken from you repeatedly with no mercy for mortality, you learn to laugh about bones, how 206 of them will crumble. You begin to smile when you see the hearse as merely spacious transportation. You lace up a pair of sneakers and run among the headstones, plastic lilies, mausoleums, engravings, and statues littering our lost loves' last lands. I visited the graveyard when the clouds stole indigo from the evening sky, when the sky inhaled before the rain, and I jogged past a silent roll call until my lungs ached and my side stitched from breathing so desperately, and I could not have felt more alive. So that was a poem that I worked on for quite a while, and then eventually I just gave up on trying to do line breaks. And then it felt very right. And so I understand that sometimes prose poems are just a sort of like a crumbling into a blockier, paragraphy type of form. But what does that mean? What is that saying about us? And I say that because I was recently in a conversation with one of my friends who's a writer, and she, in writing her poetry collection for her dissertation, came to the realization that she was not able to write lineated poetry for the past couple of months. All she could do was visual poems or prose poems. And that's been really fruitful for her work, but I laughed and I was like, well, we're having a prose poem moment. And I would love to maybe debate this with my fellow panelists or anybody else who's listening to this, but it just feels like right now publications are really seeking experimentation and form. So like I feel really energized around ways that other people are trying to do that. Prose poems obviously are what I'm focusing on right now, but I think there's a lot, like with the AI poems we just saw, that you could get into. And that sort of leads to this idea of tech. What is tech doing to the way that we want to see words in a space? Either whether that space is a page or something else. So the next poem I'm going to share is a prose poem that actually takes its lead from, I believe it's called the EKG machine, you know, like the little heartbeat monitors. Um, I realized as I was writing the lines of this poem that I was sort of including these blips. That's very much informed by both like seeing something on a screen, but then also that sort of sonic bloop, bloop, you know, indicating different things. So this one is called Hers Was the Body, Pain Management. My mother was an organ donor, I think. But when she died, I think she didn't donate that which had failed her most. Her family circumscribed the hospital bed, learned machine sounds, machine numbers. The human goal was pain management. It's what they tell you when they can't save the patient. I like it though. It meant somebody was trying for her when she tried for so many years to heal the broken, to hide the shame, to keep the marriage, to raise the children, to run the business. In her final hour, it was all we could do, manage her pain, as if it hadn't been years of erosion. If any body was deserving of rest, hers was. The body, a temple, and its sacrifice. Okay, so now is where I get to do my advertisement for a different book, which is Victoria Chang's. Although I'm probably preaching to a choir, I feel like anytime you talk to a poet, they're like, oh yeah, my life was changed by that, which I would say is true about mine as well. I think it feels at once so simple to say, like, I'm going to make a prose poem that looks like a newspaper column. And then you actually get into it and you're like, there is something really important happening there in the ways that we talk about writing about a whole life. Because what is an obituary if, you know, inspired by death, if not trying to talk about a whole life? Which, my next pitch is in my dissertation, I'm also looking at Lynn Heginian's work. I think that prose poems have such a long history and so many people try to do them so many different ways. I think it's really interesting to consider Heginian's collage, autobiographical, open form as something that leads into what we are seeing nowadays, especially from Victoria Chang, in a fascinating way. And that has obviously influenced me quite a bit. I'll put a link in the chat for the poem that I'm going to read next. But finally, it took me a couple years because I approach after poems with a real respect for the ways they can go wrong, as well as the ways that they can be informative for a writer. But I had to try my own hand at writing an obit poem. So mine is called Obit My Mother's Hands, and if you want to read along, it's in the chat. After Victoria Chang. My mother's hands died on August 1st, 2018, beside her on the hospital bed. They laid as flat as the papers of a will. Unlike paper, her hands were soft and warm. Unlike a will, they granted nothing. In them, a history of touch, archived in bottles of Jergens and a vino and scattered around the house. When we got back from the hospital, each sibling laid claim to a different piece of jewelry. I took a tanzanite ring that fit my finger only because it had been squeezed out of shape. Years of moisturizer and massages pushed the gold into a pointed oval. Tanzanite is sometimes used as December's birthstone. Heat and pressure, birthing gems. On my right ring finger, the memory of pain and treatment. The husband before the husband who gifted her this ring was born 2 days before Christmas. One, a marriage cut short. One, a marriage of heat and pain, pressure and treatment that failed. I gifted myself a botched memorial from its misshapen promise. And then moving beyond this sort of strictly, how are we doing something of like a hermit crab poem / prose poem in writing an obit, I think that idea of responsibility that comes with writing an obituary is also really fascinating. And there's another series in my own writing that I've started that is specifically prose poems that I like to think of as a little bit more dramatic. They're almost like staged or scenes that I'm writing. And all of them I call them my sitting across from poems. So all of them stage two women, the speaker and another woman, sitting across from each other to some purpose. And sort of in the spirit of what I think is the real slipperiness of prose poems. I've made my own set of rules around what has to happen in each one. Essentially, the core essence is like, what is the situation that brings these two women together, and how are they foils for each other, in one way to think of it. They're reflections of each other, but also something very tense is separating them. Some I base on real things that have happened. Some are fictionalized. I'm trying to write one that's like sitting across from Medea, if you know the play by Euripides. Fascinating female character to try to have a conversation with. But in the spirit of obituaries, I wrote one called Sitting Across from Graham to Rewrite Her Obituary. Because I didn't get it right the first time, I'm all ears, all eyes. She rises from her chair, the grandma that age never touched, permanent blonde, familiar smile lines, everything present in my earliest memories. With a hostess's perfect recall, she asks, "Do you want coffee? Milk?" Her blue eyes glitter extra as she turns her head. Cataract surgery and knee pain, her only omens of oldness. These are the details that slipped between the funeral director and the section editor and her husband and me. We're in her house, a home away from home for at least 3 generations. When her daughter died, she remothered the teenager left behind, a minor orphan. Every family fable she kept open as a Bible. I scribble and edit and scratch and amend. How many farmers markets, Penn State games, and Easter Sunday services measure the life she lived? She sets a mug by my hand, the grandma that cancer never touched, a whistler in the kitchen, patron saint of desserts. I drink in her presence and ask for her stories. She doubles my name, Oh, Maggie, Maggie, the way she always greeted me or answered the phone. Don't make a big deal about me. As part of my research, I think there's something really interesting, especially not just to maybe a one-off exploration of form. That is always really interesting, but the collections that I like to look at dig into how can we replicate that form over and over again. And I'm fascinated by, like, we're also, if you know, agree with Jahan Ramazani, in the age of anti-elegy. And so there's this like lack of resolution that happens. I think that having a whole collection like Victoria Chang does, or other writers that I look at where we replicate this form, is a really fascinating way to sort of linger in that moment of mourning, that I would contend is actually maybe a better artistic way to try to wrangle with grief. But again, that could be debatable. Um, so I will end us on maybe another weird sort of confluence of things. Um, I might boldly say my favorite type of poetry is actually erasure. And I've had some conversations with people who find erasure really troublesome, and that's fascinating. But something that I have tended to do is actually use the prose poem as the starting point for what becomes an erasure. And I did that near the end of my chapbook. So I'm going to share that in a poem called Funny Like That. 1. When they say grief is funny like that, turns out they really do mean it's funny. Like laughing for 6 minutes uninterrupted at something your lover said without thinking they were silly, until you can't breathe and your cheeks are rivers because you have laughed into the tears you knew you were going to cry hours ago, but did not have a reason to. You cry every week. There's rarely a full reason to cry, except someone you loved died some time ago and you have not forgotten it yet, not your brain or your heart or your tear ducts, so that something goes wrong, or a snatch of song moves you, or your lover tosses off a comment strikingly hilarious, and you do not even have to pretend to hold back what you spent 2 decades avoiding with all your might, and it seems like you're bursting at the seams in giggles when you are really so sad, so deep down, and only you know grief is funny like that. 2. When grief is out, it's some lover thinking they were your rivers. You've laughed the tears you were going to cry. You cry every week. There is rarely a reason. Someone you loved, you have not forgotten. Your heart goes wrong. A song moves you strikingly, and you do not hold back, avoiding all your bursting, when you are really so sad, so funny like that. 3. Grief is some lover. They were rivers you were going to cry. Every week there is a reason. Someone loved you, your heart a song, and you do not hold back. So sad, so funny. And that is all I have to share for today. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you again, Mark and Christopher. We have approximately 17 minutes or so before the end of our allotted time, and I would invite anyone who has a question to either raise your hand or to drop it in the chat. I'm happy to read it. I thought I would just ask a general question to get us going in the Q&A. And it came to me as I was listening to each of you read that a common through line between these different kinds of work is the significance of enabling constraints. So Mark's using not just the Chopin structure, but also particular lines from poets who are not writing in English. Christopher has a massive and evolving set of constraints that are furnished by and with the AI. And then Maggie's working with the primarily the generic, I guess, constraint of the obit, but then also these poetic forms like the erasure, or even the prose poem's insistence on the absence of a line break is a kind of a constraint too. So I'm wondering if you could each talk a little bit about what you, as an artist, what you get out of that move towards the formal constraint.
I'll say that it's interesting to think about constraints when working with AI, which is really a tool that's entire existence is predicated on constraints. Like you are generating constraints from the entire world of language that it has in order for it to yield something. And so behaving on that side so often, I think, kind of gives you one coloring of the notion of constraints, but then shifting as well. I I don't know. I love it. I don't know how people write without some level of constraint or form. I think in one hand, you're engaging with all of the history and the other voices that have participated in form or these specific kinds of constraints. It's extraordinary to write a sonnet for those reasons. You're also engaging with the perhaps the dangerous implications of those constraints, classical forms that maybe are representative of, patriarchy and, white and straight and able-centric thinking in the history of poetry. But also when you're working with AI and you're resembling these forms that are themselves harbingers of danger to our environment and our way of being, there is some hesitation certainly that I feel as well when I begin to participate in them. But yeah, very very pro constraints, very 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 much a fan of it.
Yeah, if I could jump on that afterward, I think that and I know I'm stealing this from somebody else, so don't give me credit for it, but like I think that constraints actually end up giving us language in moments when we are struggling to have it on our own sometimes. And maybe name a couple examples. Like I had a draft of a poem sitting in my notes app for like 4 years that just I could not finish it. It was really scrappy. And then I learned about the Ghazal form. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And sat with it for a minute. And then I was like, can I write one? And I used these like scraps that were in my notes app. And, with Ghazal, you have to have that repetitive word. To be really clear, it's a very like American version of a Ghazal. So it follows a linear progression versus having these distinct couplets. But even that was like magic to the draft that I had. Where it's like, oh, once I knew I had to repeat certain things, that actually helped me to illuminate the things I wanted to repeat. And so it gave me the language to bring these ideas I'd had together. Similarly, I think prose poems, if you're just like, if you treat it as a box and you're like, okay, now I have to fill this box, that actually frees you up to think like, well, actually, I can throw a lot more into this poem that maybe like my own brain was saying that doesn't belong here, until you fill it up and you have this little paragraph of ideas. So my general approach to constraints is thinking like, oh, this is probably going to give me something or free me up to use more than like right now I'm really feeling able to tap into.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add that constraints are a creative starting point for me. I mean, I start with, like, I don't even start with thinking about language, but rather shapes. So if I don't have a visual shape of what's going to exist in a kind of two-dimensional sphere, I could have all the language in the world, but I wouldn't know where to put it. Um, and then, you know, constraints are also generative. So I started with visual shapes, but that ended up, at least with this book, the Chopin element wasn't like, the preliminary constraint, but rather like once things started to move, it kind of breathed into that shape. But it started with visual. It almost always starts with visual components.
Would any of our audience members like to ask anything of the poets, or would the poets like to ask anything of themselves?
This
I'd
is
like to
maybe, oh, go ahead. Go
go,
ahead,
go ahead.
Mark.
Go ahead.
It's a question for you, but perhaps as well for Maggie. It's sort of a half-baked question. I appreciate so much your engagement with musicians and with the work of Mingus and Chopin, as two that you mentioned. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the ways that shapes your work, whether thinking ekphrastically or thinking as you just talked about in terms of like the physical shape that you're replicating, or if it's more of a mood and tone thing. And two, like you as somebody who does translation, are there echoes there too in the ways that you might try to hold on to certain pieces but let other pieces go as you're building work that's in conversation with other voices?
Yeah, so I mean I think that like like each project is a little bit different. I mean there's um a musical piece that poetic piece that was connected with the Polish composer Witold Lutosławski that I wrote many years ago, and that was also like related to a constraint, which was that it had to be 8 pages. So this was sort of like, okay, work with 8 pages. I mean, in the case of Chopin, it's like probably this layered thing. Like the book that Joshua mentioned, a segment appeared in Chicago Review called Airport Music. It had this whole sequence that was like these kind of broken, like little slivers of Chopin's letters reconstructed into the kind of two-handedness of his compositional structures that I felt like I wanted to like explore a little bit more. But I mean, translation is like this interesting process from the standpoint of writing, in that if I'm thinking about this book, like, what I tried to translate really was like the time signatures and the duration of the sonata form. So, if a movement was 12 minutes, then okay, so this gives me 12 pages to work with. If a movement is 2 minutes, then I have 2 pages. So in some ways, it wasn't necessarily super sophisticated. On the other hand, Chopin is somebody whose music has been like living in my brain very intensely since I was about 6 years old, and I first I didn't know it at the time, but I first heard him in Woody Woodpecker, in a Woody Woodpecker episode. And I sort of thought like, oh, that's cool. And then like years later, I learned that he, had a career, a much more vibrant career prior to Woody Woodpecker, that, added, added some depth. But I guess the translation thing is like sort of interesting in that like I think in my head for some period of time I was trying to firewall them, like kind of compartmentalize. And now like, having like bilingual kids and just being in that space, like I've just and the chaos of young kids has just been like, okay, I'm gonna let that stuff bleed in because it's surprising and fun, and it adds like some other energy, sort of acoustic energy. And also just sometimes I just like a word better. Like the Polish word for something is just, I think, superior to the English word. So then I'm just going to use that because you know why not? Thanks for the question. I don't know if Maggie wanted to. Yeah, so I mean, Chris, like one of the things I wanted to ask you was like looking at the poems, I was sort of curious about, and it made me think also about like I'm just sort of showing my age, I guess, but Erin Moray's book, A Frame of the Book or The Frame of a Book, she was using an early, I don't even know if it would be called like a large language model, but she was using some sort of technology to generate a bunch of text and then, creating poems out of it, very proactively editing. So I was sort of wondering, like, I couldn't, it wasn't clear to me, and this was more just from a creative curiosity standpoint. Like when you're working with some of these models, are you getting like a segment of text and then you're playing with it, or do you have like some idea that, or is it more connected to the specificity of a prompt that will give you X number of lines or phrases, and then you have to structure it? Uh, is it contingent on the parameters of the technology, a mix of those things?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It does at some point start to feel in some experiments as much about curation or editing as it is about composition when you're working with that much language. I'm thinking of actually, Maggie, you nodded towards erasures, and I don't historically work in erasures, but I think that AI, getting language from AI has yielded interesting opportunities to work in that form because you're generating these long blocks of language, asking questions like, how would you define a poem? And then taking the interesting text that comes out of that and turning that into an erasure poem, or just selecting bits and pieces from it to curate into a poem itself. But yeah, it's fun. Again, this idea of constraints, you have at your fingertips not everything that's ever been written, but so much language, and to try to distill that into something meaningful and resonant, which I guess is in some ways what our brains are doing in trying to compose, but it does become kind of a whittling down. And in some experiments, I will definitely cheat. Like there are a few poems in there where the language was not entirely what the AI had spit back out. There was some whittling and tweaking that's done. But yeah, I think that's a fun part of the process. It makes it in some ways feel a little more bodily, a little more physical to be doing that manipulation. Um, yeah, Maggie, I wonder how you feel about that in your work, which seems very engaged in shape and in building pieces.
I will say I really like that you just made the sort of bodily connection because um, I often feel like a pretty tactile, like I really like baking. That's another thing I like to do. And part of the reason I love it is because your hands get involved. And I do think, erasure poetry is just the other side of the coin from blackout poetry. So there is a sort of felt experience that goes with it. And so I like you making that connection, especially because one of the things people often pose with erasure is like you are manipulating text, and then like how are you manipulating story or experience? Um, I feel very safe to erase my own poems, to use them as the source, and then go from there because I'm giving myself permission. And I think there are other ways, like if you're working with AI or a large language model, and you take that approach, I think there's similarly like a lot of permissions in that. But what an interesting thing to try to play with as well. Um, so I think that's the only addition to that conversation I can make.
So there is a question from Paulina in the chat for Mark, which I'll read and then tweak to sort of solicit some thoughts from Maggie and Christopher too. The question is, how does your work as a translator of Polish poetry shape your own diction? I guess presumably in English. What do you look for in the Polish diction? And you sort of anticipated this a little bit in your response to Christopher. And I guess we can just, after Mark says his piece, I'm curious, diction is one of the elements of poetry. I mean, I teach it to my introduction to literature students. And we're just about to do it. And but it's often tied up with the representation of poetry in terms of speech. And not all of you have the same proximity to speech in your work. So I'm interested in hearing you talk about the concept of diction, in addition to this question of Polish bilingual resources.
So, I mean, to Paulina's question, I can give like a really specific in the weeds example of how this has gotten into my creative processes, and then like a more broad general one. But the specific one is that like I'll encounter a word that I wasn't familiar with, that I like an idiom or some expression. So I encountered the word gówniaki, right? And so and sometimes I'll ask my students at the university, like, okay, so can you give me a little bit more context on this word, like, because I started thinking like, all right, so what would be the English equivalent? And gówniaki would sort of roughly be translated as like shitlings. So it's like a derisive term for people who are younger than you. But what I was wondering is like, is there an upper age limit for, is there an age in which one could not be a guvnaki, or does it work in the way that kind of like shitbird would work in English? And I kind of thought that it was sort of like shitbird. But then I started to think like there might be an age in which a shitbird grows up, and so that was where like the term shithawk appeared in the poem, because I like to think of a shithawk as a slightly more sophisticated, more grown up version of a shitbird. So that would be the specific thing. I think that generally speaking, I'm interested in, like, I've said some version of this before, but there's this quote from Robert Duncan that stuck with me when I was a student and has been bouncing in my head ever since. Go write yourself a book and put therein what might define a world. And that, translationally speaking, that's an attractive proposition for me. Like, I'm not really trying to find, the Polish Mark Tardi. I'm interested in the work that like I just couldn't imagine. So that's where somebody like, I mean, she was here briefly, but she left. Zosha Chapulitz. She writes in a way that like I would never imagine, this kind of looseness, and she's just kind of like playing with um, the bullet point kind of corpo speak, and in these ways that I just don't have the facility for. So like that's a part that's just, interesting to me. Like, okay, this looks like something, like Kacper Barczak's work doesn't, I don't think anybody would confuse his poetry for mine, or Robert Rubitsky. Like, I would seriously doubt that somebody would confuse the work for mine. So it's like this, it feels like this really interesting, energizing opportunity to kind of inhabit, a different planet, a different sort of poetic planet, and then and see if I can, give it, give it some oxygen in a different language. It, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. I just thought also about the listening in music in your poetry, that you sort of listen very intensely to sounds, and that music actually, and perhaps the foreign inserts, the code switching, that it actually functions as a sort of dislocation. And it's interesting to see how music actually is not entirely unifying in your poetry. That's why I thought also of how Polish actually changes the texture of your work, that it's
Mhm.
not sort of smooth, but more rough and rugged on the edges, a kind of language that shudders all
Mhm.
the time of it. So I thought of you now. I'm thinking of your poetry as a poetry of dislocation, whether you like it or not. Thank you
Yeah.
guys for this wonderful evening in Poland. Thank you.
Christopher and Maggie, did you want to add anything to the question about diction?
Um, I think that was a really great response. I'll just say, like, in my practice, sometimes I'm thinking of diction after sound and after shape. I know, Mark, you had mentioned thinking of shape first. Sometimes for me, it's really about what what music is occurring, and what happens to the words in the space before the words themselves actually um, take place, and then always looking for words that are generating both this sense of energy and this sense of like perfect rest when you're creating the poem, that are sort of pushing against the parameters, the text, the textures. The Paulina that you were just referencing, I think is incredibly important. I also think in the writing of poetry against a world of AI, like our own personal dictions, our own personal voices are so important, because that is something that we can offer in contrast to an AI that is generating more language than we could ever generate and doing it at a speed we could never generate, but never in the world that each of us would make with our word choice, to borrow an idea from Mark. So yeah, I think of those things.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I'm also thinking, for me, maybe at this point in my life, and maybe this will be always, I think that poetry is a wonderful way to interrogate diction, and the world that we're creating or that we see other people creating. So two examples. I wrote one poem for a friend who experienced a miscarriage and was really struggling to talk about it. And one of the things I did in the poem was I played with interchangeability of language, because it's, do you call that a baby? At what point do you call it a baby? Is one of the things that she was playing with. And so using the poem, the poem is called Baby because it's like, what are the other things that we go into in order to talk about that. And then back to my point about Medea, also very charged figure of Greek mythology. The way that people describe her, I have a poem where I literally go to the dictionary and I try to find words from the same page where like other terms are, and I like play with that idea of interchangeability. So maybe for me personally, I love a poetry that interrogates diction or uses its own diction to put the reader in maybe an unsettled place.
Thank you. Well, we technically have 4 minutes left. So if anyone would like to ask another question, you're more than welcome to. But if no one has a question to ask, perhaps we should merely conclude by thanking Mark, Christopher, and Maggie for wonderful reading. And I wish you were all joining us in person later on this week here in Louisville, and I encourage all of you to think about that in the future. Thank you to the 3 poets.
Thank you very much. Excellent
Thank
session.
you.
I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you again, Joshua, for chairing.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.